Today on the show, I'm joined by Professor Nancy Pearcey. She's the author of The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes, as well as Love Thy Body, The Soul of Science, Saving Leonardo, Finding Truth and Total Truth, probably some other books and articles that I don't have listed here. But she's a professor and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University. She's been quoted in The New Yorker and Newsweek, highlighted as one of the 5 top women apologists by Christianity Today, and hailed in The Economist as America's preeminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual. Nancy Pearcey, welcome to Restitutio.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So I first came across your work when a friend of mine told me he loved Total Truth, which I've got over here, Total Truth, so much that he read the same book. He read that book every year. And I thought, wow, I don't know anyone else whose books are getting read like that often. And so it intrigued me. I got to read it myself, was really interested in the whole worldview approach. And but it was really the Love Thy Body book that hooked me. I really enjoyed this one. I think it was 2018, if I'm not mistaken. And it was such a interesting book. It hooked me. And so now this new book, The Toxic War on Masculinity, has outdone them all, in my opinion. It's just such a fascinating read. I've learned so much about the history of masculinity in America, which I was not expecting. I just thought it was just another culture war book, which I'm happy to read anyhow. But this was really a lot deeper. And I found it very challenging, especially the last whole section. You really challenged husbands in a healthy way. I felt challenged, and I've tried to make some changes in my marriage with my wife and get a little more involved and so forth. But so I just want to say thanks for courageously stepping out on the limb here and writing this book.
Well, thank you. And I didn't realize when I started that it was going to take courage, to tell you the truth. But it has, in fact, been the most controversial book that I've ever written. I really thought Love Thy Body would be more controversial because it deals with issues like abortion, homosexuality, transgenderism, which is really exploding today. But in fact, this one caused more controversy, at least in Christian circles. Here's an example. When I was writing the manuscript, I taught several classes on it. I led several reading groups. I like to get lots of feedback, rub off all the rough edges. And when they would tell their family and friends about it, so people who weren't actually seeing the book, just hearing about it, initially their first question was always, whose side is she on? With that tone, right? Whose side is she on?
Yeah.
And by the way, the second question was always, and why is a woman writing a book on masculinity anyway? So this is what I was up against in all through the writing process. I rewrote that first chapter multiple times because I had to sort of overcome that suspicion, that almost hostility that people have when they're just triggered by the word masculinity. So, and even after the book came out, I don't know if you follow Twitter at all, but the day after the book came out, it was jumped on by Christian egalitarians who accused me of giving ammunition, their word, to complementarians, even though I don't even address that in the book.
Yeah, you didn't get into it.
I didn't. I even explain why I don't, because a social scientist said it doesn't seem to make much difference. So I'm giving you data from the social scientist.
Yeah.
And then once that calmed down, I started getting not nearly as vicious, but some counter attacks from conservatives as well. So all that to say, it has something to make everyone angry, I guess.
Yes. So, and everyone should read it and see what it says, because it's accessible, but it's also very evidence-based. And I really appreciated that.
Yes, it's the most fact-based book I've written. So it starts with evidence from sociology on what Christian men are actually like. What are they like? Get rid of the accusations back and forth. What are they actually like? Let's look at the social science data where they went out and actually surveyed evangelicals. And then, as you mentioned a minute ago, there's a lot of history there too, because I wanted to show where the secular definition of masculinity comes from. As you know, since you've read my books, I'm an apologist at heart. So my
Yes.
goal really is to answer the charges from the secular world. It's a secular world that says, masculinity is toxic. And if you want to counter any social trend, you need to ask, where did it come from? How did it develop? And so that's really my goal, is to get to the bottom of the secular charges, understand where they're coming from, and how we can respond to them more effectively.
Yeah. I appreciate that your book is not just masculinity according to Nancy Pearcey and what you what you crazy guys should change or something like that. It's very much historical. It's broad in its approach, and it is very research based. And you seem like you were very circumspect not to inject your own opinion. I don't think I encountered your own opinion very much. It was just like, this is what these people did. This is what this movement contributed, and so forth. Very, very, very objective, if I can put it that way. So you're to be commended on that. Your book confronts a number of lies and half-truths and false stereotypes floating around in the culture today. So I thought we could get your response to a number of incorrect statements I've concocted. And so these are sentences that on their surface appear obviously true, but when examined closely turn out to be false. So I've written 10. I don't know how many we can get to in this conversation, but what do you think? Are you ready to debunk some false myths?
Yes, I loved reading your list. So I'd love to get started on your list of false accusations that we often hear, especially against Christian men.
All right. So number 1, Bible-believing Christians are slightly more likely to divorce than non-Christians or liberal Christians.
Yeah. So talking about Twitter feed, I've gotten that several times in recent days. And it's also something that we hear in the church, right? In fact, that's probably the first pushback I get, is that don't Christians divorce at the same rate as the rest of the culture, or even higher? And so the sociologists were looking at accusations like that. And so what they did is they did the studies. They did the studies, and here's what they found. They made a careful distinction between evangelical men who are actually committed to their faith, who attend church regularly, versus nominal Christian men. And that distinction made all the difference, because committed Christian men actually test out the best of all groups in America. In other words, they test out as the most loving husbands and fathers. Their wives test out the highest in terms of saying they feel happy with their husband's expressions of love and affection. Evangelical fathers spend the most time with their children, 3.5 more hours per week than secular men, both in shared activities like sports or church youth group, and in discipline like setting limits on screen time or enforcing bedtime. Evangelical couples actually divorce at a lower rate than any other major group in society, 35% lower than secular men, and they have the lowest rates of domestic violence of any group in America. So this was a real shocker, because we've all heard the charges that you just mentioned, that that believing in any form of male headship in the home turns evangelical men into overbearing, tyrannical, coercive patriarchs. Tyrannical. Did I say tyrannical?
Yeah.
Trying to get all those words in there.
Yeah. I mean, there's no question that as a pastor who regularly preaches, I'm the lead pastor here at a church in New York, upstate New York, and this stat has since tormented me. This idea that the Bible, in a sense, the Bible doesn't work. If you apply the Bible to your marriage, you divorce more. It's just sort of like something that really has not fit for me. But I'm the sort of person that wants to accept facts as they are and see if we can do better. And so reading that early on in your book, that actually, no, the Bible is not hurting marriages, is helping men to be, well, not just men and women to stay together more frequently. That was just like mind blowing. It was just like, this is a breath of fresh air. And I think it's a great place to start, because you are wading into treacherous waters where there are all kinds of sharks and piranha and electric eels out to get you. So I think to start somewhere complementary is good, because that does make sense to me, that like guys that and women that are consciously, and I guess the big determining factor is regularly attending church services as a measurement of how serious they are about their faith, that it would have an impact. So I appreciate that. On my next statement, you already just kind of dipped your toes into it, but I wonder if you could elaborate it. It is number 2 is Bible-believing Christian men are more likely to be harsh and abusive to their wives and children. What do you think?
Right. So let's go back to that distinction. When I said church-going, committed Christian men test out at the top. And by the way, I'm glad you mentioned that. We don't hear this very often. I had to go digging in the academic literature to find this. Yes. And this is really the final reason, the final trigger that made me decide to write this book, as I was overwhelmed. I was stunned. It's so counter to the media narratives. And I said, we need to get this out there. This is not just a religious figure, giving a pep talk. This is evidence-based findings from the social sciences. But the reason that we have the wrong impression is the social scientists went back and made that crucial distinction of nominal Christians, right? These are men who on a survey like that might check the Baptist box, for example, but it's who rarely, if ever, attend church. It's more of a family background, cultural background. These are cultural Christians. And they test out shockingly different. They test out with all the toxic stereotypes. Mm-hmm. Their wives report the lowest level of happiness with their husband's treatment of them. They spend the least amount of time with their children. They have the highest rate of divorce, higher than secular men, 20% higher than secular men. And they have the highest rate of domestic abuse and violence, higher than secular men. And so what's happened is most studies have just looked at evangelicals, as an overarching category. So they're picking up men who are better than secular men and men who are worse than secular men. And that's why the numbers get skewed. And it does suggest, a different way maybe that churches can deal with this issue. On the one hand, I think they should be more positive and supportive of men who are doing a good job. Yes. One of my graduate students is the leader of a women's ministry in a large Baptist church here in Houston. And she said, on Mother's Day, we hand out flowers and tell the women they're wonderful. On Father's Day, we scold the men and tell them to do better. Mm. And so I was very careful not to have a scolding tone in this book, because I think we should get this positive information out there. Mm. And here's another example. So in my class at Houston Christian University, when I told them I was writing a book on masculinity, one of the male students shot back, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us."
Oh.
So yeah. So in Christian circles, men are also feeling beaten down and demoralized. They're picking up the message, that masculinity is toxic. And we need to counter that in the church. It does suggest too that we need to do something about these nominal men. If they're sort of hanging around the fringes of the Christian world and claiming an identity as evangelicals, how do we reach out to them? They are using the language of headship and submission, but they're not giving a biblical meaning to those terms. Instead, they're importing meaning, infusing meaning from the secular script for masculinity. Yeah. And so how do we disciple these men, insofar as we have access to them because they're hanging around, the edges of the Christian world? How can the church have a better ministry to disciple these men?
That's really an excellent question to address, because it's these guys on the fringe, as you point out, that the old-fashioned word for it are hypocrites. They're people that are going to talk the talk but not walk the walk, and they're giving the rest of us a bad name. And yet, as a pastor, I can tell you, I could easily identify who those people are in my church, right? But I will say this, that we are hopeful that by having them come whenever it is they happen to come, that something will sink in and that they will have a true heart change. So I think It's a hard thing to figure out. We can't just cast everyone out of the church who's not living up to the standard of Christianity. Some churches have tried that, but it ends up with this very judgmental, holier than thou kind of environment. So you're right. It is a really thorny problem, but it is important to address for sure. Well, let's move on to number 3. So the Bible's endorsement, and this is kind of a big one, so feel free to answer it however you like, because a lot of the book talks about this. But the Bible's endorsement of male patriarchy, we're told, causes toxic masculine behaviors. What do you think?
Yes, that's one of the reasons that I relied so heavily on the social science data. What was happening was, of course, evangelical men were being held up as exhibit A of toxic masculinity. It was very easy to find examples with a quick Google search, but I will give you just one example. So this was the co-founder of the Church Too movement, which came after the Me Too movement. And she said, the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today. So what happened was the social scientists, psychologists, sociologists were reading these accusations and saying, oh, where's your evidence? You're making these charges, but where's your data? And that's what really sent them back to the data to do the studies. In my book, I cite some dozen studies or so. And so what that means is I was just looking at what the social scientists were actually finding. Like some people have said, well, wait a minute, who cares what the social scientists found? I want to know what the spokesmen say, right? What do the theologians say? What does this Danvers statement say, for example, which is on complementarianism, egalitarianism, and so on. And frankly, that's not what I was concerned about. I don't want to hear what the spokesmen say. I wanted to answer the secular charge, which is, if you believe in this theology, it will turn you into an overbearing, tyrannical, coercive patriarch. And my question was, does it? Does it? Let's look at what it does do, in fact, in terms of these surveys of evangelical couples. And so I have 2 chapters on this. And I was, to tell you the truth, I was blown away by the surveys. The surveys where they went to Christian couples and said, do you believe in male headship? And the majority, not all, but the majority of evangelicals would say yes. And then they would say, well, what do you think it means? How do you live it out? And I was blown away. They was the loving, respectful, mutual understanding that they had of headship. They would not usually define it in terms of, the final authority or the tiebreaker or the breadwinner. The most frequent definition was spiritual leader. And then they'd be asked, well, what does that mean? And of course, they would start with the practical things, get your family to church, get your kids to youth group, have family devotions and family prayer. But it also, most of them would talk about the intangibles as well, right? That you're responsible for your children's spiritual growth. You're responsible for your wife's spiritual health. And the most frequent verse they quoted was Ephesians 5, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. And that might not sound significant to you, but when I had chapters later on abuse in Christian homes, I literally ran into people who said they never heard that verse. One woman who said, I had to go look it up in the Bible. I didn't believe it was there. I had never heard a sermon on Ephesians 5, the part of it that is addressed to husbands. And there was another example where there's a pastor who works with abusive men in court-ordered counseling. Most abusive men are not in counseling unless it's court-ordered. But this is a Christian pastor, and he was working with a man who was abusive, and his wife had actually fled the home to escape from his physical abuse. And he kept quoting the first part of Ephesians 5. She's supposed to submit to me. This is wrong. She can't leave the home. And so the pastor said, well, what about this other part of Ephesians 5? And he said, the man was shocked. He had never heard the part of Ephesians 5 that was addressed to husbands. And so that's why it's so significant that the committed Christian men and couples that was what they quoted all the time. Ephesians 5, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. And so I went to the actual, studies, the surveys done of Christian couples to see, how do you live it out? What do you think it means? And that's what I report in the book.
Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of your book gets into the history of masculinity in America. And I thought that was really eye-opening because as a pastor, as somebody who's done a lot with early church history, Old Testament history, New Testament history, Second Temple Judaism, I could tell you all about the Roman Empire. There's these like memes going around. How often do you think about the Roman Empire? Too much. That's my answer. But American history, I'm not so strong on, and much less with respect to gender. And I really found this research you did fascinating. So my next myth is about the suffragette movement. So, and it goes like this. Number 4, women initiated the suffragette movement in America because they wanted to be treated as individuals of equal value. It sounds just like obviously true, right? But is it?
No, it's not true. First of all, women didn't initiate it. A small group of women did, the early feminists. But even they acknowledged that most women were against it at the time. I had so many readers. You remember I said I had readers on my manuscript. I had so many readers who were skeptical of that I went out and find the quotes, from people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and other early feminists saying the main opposition to the vote for women is other women. So I got the quotes from people saying that. And then why were they opposed to it? Because they did not want to be treated as individuals. It was just the opposite. Here's this framework to understand it. The vote was not described in that day as men's vote versus women's vote. It was framed as household vote versus individual vote.
Right.
And most women wanted the household vote. And why did they want that? Because it put responsibility on men to take into account the interests of their entire household. And that even broader, I'll try to be short, but even broader, it was a shift in political philosophy. The early America was governed by a political philosophy that saw social institutions like the family as an organic unit, not just a collection of individuals who happened to be there, but there's an organic unit connecting them all to one another. And therefore there was a common good. In other words, I look out for what's good for me, you look out for what's good for you, but who looks out for the common good of the marriage, of the family, of the church, of the school, and so on? That's what authority was for. Authority was a person who was not supposed to look out for his own interest. The favorite word at the time was he should be disinterested, by which they meant he doesn't pursue his own interests. He's the one who's responsible for the common good of the whole. Mm-hmm. America, roughly after the revolution, began to shift from that political philosophy to a political philosophy called social contract theory, which does see societies and social institutions as collections of autonomous individuals who've just come together out of a common interest. Well, in that case, there is no common good, right? And so men were no longer held responsible for the common good. And so many women at the time realized this is actually letting men off the hook. It's giving them a pass on moral responsibility. They're no longer held responsible for the common good of the entire household. And so that's how the debate was framed. Many women at the time said, well, we want our men to sense that they are responsible for their wife and children. And back then the household was larger, right? So it included extended family and servants and so on. The man was in charge of a small commonwealth. So anyway, it was women who opposed the vote largely. And it was because they saw it as a way that men were going to be held to a reduced standard, that we were lowering the standard on male responsibility. Now, I would say that eventually most women came around to it. It took about a century. Eventually, women came around to supporting it. But why? They did not support it as long as, see, the early feminists framed it in terms of autonomy and individual rights. That did not speak to most women. Women came around to supporting it when the temperance movement began to say, this can be a way that we can hold men in check, because men are drinking, they're coming home drunk and beating their wives and children, and women have little recourse when that happens. And so the head of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, her name was Frances Willard. Historians say she was the most influential woman of the entire 19th century. And she began to see the vote as a way to give women power in the temperance movement against drunken, abusive husbands. And so she renamed it. She called it the Ballot for Home Protection.
Oh.
Now, if it was about home protection, women were for it. So that shift is why women came around to endorsing it. Again, not for the reasons we think, autonomy and individual rights, but this is a way to give us some leverage against some of the common male vices of drunkenness and abuse. Home protection.
Yeah, that's very good. There's just so, at every turn, seems like there's so much more to the story than, on the surface you think, oh, well, women were hopelessly oppressed, and, until they got the right to vote, they couldn't do anything about it. That's kind of like the typical way of saying it, but it's so much more complicated and nuanced. And, this dance between men and women in American history is incredible to see it going back and forth throughout your book. So what about the statement, our time today, the 21st century, is the first when women in America have publicly accused men of toxic behavior? You think that's true?
Well, I just gave you a good example.
You did.
Where the temperance movement certainly popularized a lot of public rhetoric that was very critical of men. Here's the bigger picture on that too. So America was becoming more secular. And as that happened, they were governing their behavior less by a biblical ethic, naturally. And how did that happen? Well, the material conditions that gave rise to secularism are this. Before the Industrial Revolution, men worked alongside their wives and children all day on the family farm, family industry, the family business. And so the cultural expectation on men focused a lot more on their caretaking role, on their, like I said a minute ago, their responsibility for the common good of the whole. Even a secular historian says the masculine virtue was defined as duty to God and man. So how did, and this is a surprising, I love these surprising facts that come out of history. A surprising fact is that most literature on child rearing was addressed to fathers. If you go to a bookstore today, they're mostly addressed to mothers. Yes. But back then, they were addressed to fathers. Fathers were considered the primary parent. And so men were given a lot more responsibility for the family. The Industrial Revolution takes work out of the home. And of course, men had to follow their work out of home into factories and offices. And for the first time, they were not working with family members, people they loved and had a moral bond with. They were working as individuals in competition with other men. And that's when you see the literature start to change. People began to protest that men were becoming individualistic, self-interested, egocentric, make it at all costs, greedy and acquisitive, to use the language of the day. And that they were making their career their idol. As they were losing their biblical loyalty, they were making their career their idol. And I mean, actually using language from the day, they complained that men were starting to make an idol out of financial success. And so the first time that we see negative language applied to the male character was in the 19th century after the Industrial Revolution. And the secularization was happening at the same time. In a sense, with the Industrial Revolution, a large public sphere developed. Society kind of split into private and public. And people began to, public, what do I mean by that? Factories, businesses, financial institutions, universities, and of course the state. And people began to argue that these large public institutions should be operated by scientific principles. by which they meant value free. In other words, don't bring your private values into the public realm, which is what we hear today.
Yes.
And since it was men who were getting that secular education and working in that secular field, they were becoming more secular in their outlook before women did. Mm-hmm. And so naturally, are we surprised that the 19th century saw a huge increase in what are kind of traditional male vices like drinking and gambling and fighting and crime and prostitution? And that's why there was, in response to that, a huge flowering of reform movements. And the reform movements are where you see the negative language really develops as they begin to attack men for all of these vices. I'll give you a quote. So one of my favorite historians puts it this way: all of these reform movements were implicit condemnations of males. There was little doubt as to the sex of the tavern keeper, the slave master, the drunkard, and the seducer. Mm-hmm. So the language of the 19th century was almost as hostile as anything that we hear today from radical feminists.
Yeah. It's interesting, if there's smoke, there's usually fire, right? And you do get into that a little bit at the end of the book, some of the misbehavior of men that's driving the modern complaints about toxic masculinity. I think a lot of pundits and advocates today for men are not really delving into the misbehavior of men in our own time, but I think getting this historical perspective can really help us to see, okay, well, what did you want the women to do? You want them to just get beaten and treated like punching bags in the home? Of course they rose up and they advocated, and there was rhetoric, and women are powerful, just like men are powerful, women are powerful. So it makes sense that would happen. You talk so much, and this is probably the biggest thing that blew my mind in a lot of the historical work you did. You talk so much about the Industrial Revolution, and you've already touched on it here, but this next myth really ties into that. Number 6, men have traditionally worked outside of the home and have been the breadwinners. I think so many of us are under that impression, especially as conservatives, as Christians, Bible-believing men. We're like, oh yeah, it's my job to work outside the home and be the breadwinner. And if I just do that, then I've satisfied what God requires of me. What do you think about that one?
Yeah, I think again the fact that the literature on parenting was addressed to fathers speaks to the fact that fathers were in the home. See, what happened is with the family industry, the family business, the home was the economic center of society. They didn't have this distinction. A father could be working at home and raising his kids, and so could a mother, by the way. A lot of manufacture was household manufacture. Think of Proverbs 31, right? The woman who's running several businesses, she wasn't going to an office to do that. She was working out of her home. And that was the case. That was case right up until the Industrial Revolution. Both men and women could be involved in economically productive work while raising their kids. And in fact, historians say that fathers were just as involved with their children as mothers were. So that kind of blows your mind too. Wait, just as involved as mothers were? I mean, it's just hard for us to use our historical imagination, to think what that was like. So what we have to remember is prior to the Industrial Revolution, we're talking about all of human history. We're talking about millennia.
Yes.
So it's only very recently in human history, namely the 19th century, that fathers began to work out of the home. And by the way, another thing that this helps explain is why our fathers ridiculed and mocked so much in the media today. That was another one that I thought, well, we all know this is true. Homer Simpson, from advertisements to animations and to movies, fathers are, the doofus dad, the bumbling idiot. My own son loved the Berenstain Bears. Did you ever read those?
Yeah.
So, the dad was always the bumbling idiot. Anyway, where did that come from? Well, when fathers were taken out of the home at the Industrial Revolution, they did lose touch with their children compared to when they worked side by side all day. They didn't know their children as well. They didn't know what was happening, their family dynamics. And already in the 19th century, you see people say, fathers are becoming kind of irrelevant, to the family, and even incompetent. The idea that he's incompetent. If he doesn't know what's going on in his family, he doesn't know the solutions. He doesn't know how to solve the family problems, so he's considered incompetent. And you see it in the literature of the day. So again, there are deep roots to this, and of course, it does also suggest what the solution is. The solution is, can we reconnect fathers to their children even after the industrial age? Are there ways to tweak the workplace? I have a whole chapter on that, and the pandemic had a very small silver lining in that a lot of fathers discovered they do like being at home more. One study found that 65% of fathers don't want to go back to the office full time. They prefer some kind of hybrid setup. And this one's not in the book because it just came out recently, but the New York Times had an article, and the title was something like, "During the pandemic, many fathers got closer to their children and they don't want to lose that." So I think that's encouraging, that when fathers had a chance to be close to their kids, a lot of them said, "This is great. Look what I've been missing out on." And so I would like to, I think Christians should really think creatively about ways to flex the workplace. I read interviews with a lot of fathers who said, "I'm willing to pay the daddy penalty." They know they may not move forward quite as quickly in their career if they take more time off to have time with their kids. But most of them said it was well worth paying the daddy penalty.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, let's say you choose to work, an extra 10 to 20 hours a week so that you're always the one who gets in the report or finishes the project, and you find some upward mobility, and what do? You just move your house to a different neighborhood. You move to a different neighborhood, buy a fancier house. Now you've got, some more expensive cars. Maybe you have a more expensive boat. Maybe you're going to a farther away place for vacation, but it's not it's not worth the sacrifice to not know your children and to not be able to have a healthy marriage that lasts. So I think a lot of times, I'll just speak as a preacher. We tell women, "Oh, well, don't sacrifice your family for the sake of your career," because we see so much pressure to do that now in whatever wave of the feminist movement we're in right now, and so much celebration for women in the workplace. Any kind of achievement is celebrated, and yet the same is true for men. Don't sacrifice your family for your career, because at the end of the day, you're going to be sitting on your yacht with people you don't even know, people that don't even care about, even if you did succeed to that degree. So there's a lot of wisdom here and you did a lot with scripture too. I didn't really talk about that in this, but early on, especially, there's a lot with scripture that you do to sort of ground masculine and feminine ideals in scripture. So let's switch sides. We were just talking about how the men are the breadwinner, which you say is a new term that was unused before the Industrial Revolution. Just a totally foreign idea. But what about on the women's side? Traditionally, women focused on keeping the home and raising the children rather than contributing economically, right?
They didn't have to make that decision. There wasn't an either or choice until the Industrial Revolution took work out of the home. Remember, it took women's work out of the home too, not just men's work. So women back then, a lot of household manufacture was presided over by women. So can you imagine when you had to cook everything from scratch, churn your butter, bake your bread, and even grind your flour? And when you had to make all your clothing from scratch, you had to card the wool or the cotton, and you had to weave it, you had to design it and cut it out. I mean, canning and preserving food, making buttons, making candles. Women's work was extremely rich and varied. Women had a lot of different skills they had to master. So in many ways, that was more intellectually challenging too. And so it was a true loss, a genuine loss, when all of that was taken out of the home. Life got easier on the other hand, it got a lot more boring. You know, when all that's left now is early childcare and cleaning. I mean, you know, that's why you have advertisements that glorify, you know, getting your sink cleaner. um, and, um, so I think that that's an important thing to recognize, because it was one of the causes of the feminist movement. Like many secular movements, it identified a true problem. It just gave the wrong solution. And most people don't want women to follow men out of the home if it means leaving kids in substitute care, right? They really want parents raising their own kids. So what women are doing today, though, in my studies, I found that the vast majority of women who are home with their kids are doing some kind of home-based business or home-based work, because it's almost impossible in our economy not to have two incomes, but women want to be home. And so white collar work is the easiest, of course, in a knowledge economy. So there's all kinds of IT professionals and writers and editors and marketers. And I list several of them in the book. But blue collar and pink collar work can be done from home to some extent as well. I give the story of when I went to have my hair styled, and the woman had a beauty chair, the kind of chair you have in a beauty shop, in her basement. One chair. And so while she's working with her customer, her client, she's got a glass door that looks out onto the backyard in a fenced in backyard. So she's we're keeping an eye on her kids. And blue collar workers, this is some of the pushback I get is, what about men? Isn't this kind of an elitist thing that, men can come home? Well, aspects of almost every job can be done at home. A friend of ours owns a car repair shop. For the most part, he's not going to bring his cars home. Although sometimes he does work on friends' cars that is in his driveway, but he can bring his bookkeeping home.
That's right.
He can bring his bookkeeping home, and in the evening, he's sitting there working while his kids are sitting beside him at the kitchen table and doing their homework. And he's talking to them, he's answering their questions. And so there's aspects of almost every job that can be done at home while your children are young. I'm not saying it's the ideal for everybody at every stage of life. I'm just worried about the kids. Mm-hmm. While your children are young, that's when I recommend people trying to find at least some aspect that can be done from home, at least part-time.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it certainly is the case that with the way our economy is and inflation and everything else, that being a single income household is closed to most people. Even if you would want to be a stay-at-home mom, it's just hard. You have to make some serious sacrifices. And a lot depends on what's available too, whether or not you can do that and where you live and so forth. But let's talk about solutions. My myth number 8 here: blocking or limiting men's testosterone will solve the problems of our society with badly behaved men.
Well, I think we have to start.
Don't you love silver bullets?
We have to start with, how did God create men? Right. And by the way, this is one of the questions I always got, and therefore I had to put it at the front of the book. People would say, well, what do you think are the differences between men and women then? Well, let's start with basic biology. Men are larger, faster, stronger, 75% greater upper body muscle mass, 90% greater upper body strength. Oh, and I just read this one the other day. It was something like 300%. It was very high. 300% more punch force. Any woman who's been abused knows that. And because of testosterone, men do tend to be more aggressive and more risk-taking. And I think we have to start with just saying, well, this is how God made men, and therefore it is intrinsically good. This is before the fall. These are the traits that God created men with. And I have to tell you, one of the things I found most encouraging is I have a couple of studies of men around the world, and they find that men do know that these unique masculine strengths are not given them just to get whatever they want, right? To dominate others, but are given them to provide and protect. I'll give you one of them. this was a study done by an anthropologist. It was the first ever cross-cultural study done by on concepts of masculinity. And what he found out is, of course, there's differences between cultures, but what they all share is what this anthropologist called the 3 Ps. It is expected that the good man will provide, protect, and procreate, meaning become a father, right? Have a family, build into the next generation, right? Be future oriented. And this was all across the world. These were not countries with a Western or a Christian background. And I thought it was really amazing to see that this just seems to be an inherent, innate knowledge that men have universally. I would say they're made in God's image, and therefore they inherently know that their unique masculine strengths were not given them to just get whatever they want, but to provide, protect, and build into the future, the next generation. And I think this gives us a better approach when we're dealing with men, is we can try to tap into that innate, inherent knowledge. You know, men don't respond well to being called toxic. You know, nobody would. But what we can do is to tap into their inherent, innate knowledge of what it does mean to be a good man, what it does mean to use their unique strengths and abilities for good. And so in that way, we support masculinity as God created it, including the testosterone. And then we can then be, obviously, and my book is full of criticism of the secular definition of masculinity. I have no problem with being a good critical thinker in analyzing secular thought. But we should start with really supporting, affirming, and respecting men for the way God created them.
Yeah, that's so helpful, because I think so many of us are feeling beaten down. I've got 4 sons. My oldest is 17. And, just seeing how society is telling them over and over, be more feminine, change yourself. And of course, who's celebrated? Guys who dress like women. Those are like the most popular kids in the school now. It's everything is kind of flipped on the trans LGBT and Q and so forth. In the last few years. And, the message they're receiving is, if you could just be more like Sally, then, you'd be really great. And, I think we want to avoid toxic masculinity, but we don't want to avoid masculinity, right? There's a difference there.
Yeah. Let me give you another study. And again, I love these studies done by non-Christians.
Yeah.
But this was a study, again, I put this at the front of the book as well, because I was answering, remember I said, people would say, whose side is she on? Well, you don't have to take a side, because there are different scripts for masculinity. And this study brought it out very well. This is done by a sociologist. And again, it's global. So this is around the world, it's universal. He gets invited to speak around the world. So he came up with this clever experiment where he asked young men 2 questions. The first question was, what does it mean to be a good man? If you're at a funeral and in the eulogy, somebody says he was a good man, what does that mean? Young men all around the world had no trouble answering that. They would immediately say things like honor, duty, integrity, sacrifice, do the right thing, look out for the little guy, be a provider, be a protector, be responsible. And the sociologists would say, where'd you learn that? And they'd say, I don't know, it's just in the air we breathe. Or if they were in a Western country, they would often say it's part of our Judeo-Christian heritage. And then he would follow up with a second question, and he'd say, well, what does it mean if I say to you, man up, be a real man? And the young men would say, oh no, that's completely different. That means be tough, be strong, never show weakness, win at all costs, suck it up, play through pain, be competitive, get rich, get laid. I'm using their language. And so the sociologist concludes that there is an inherent universal knowledge of what it means to be the good man. Another way we could talk about this from a Christian perspective is general revelation, right? General revelation is what we know on the basis of creation, apart from scripture. There are truths that we can know through general revelation. It's also Romans 2, right? Everyone has a conscience. So What these non-Christians anthropologists are finding is that it is a universal awareness that men aspire to be the good man, but they are also feeling this cultural pressure to be the quote unquote real man. And as you saw, those were somewhat more toxic traits, especially if they are disconnected, decoupled from a moral vision. They can slide into, the Andrew Tate phenomenon that we see today, where masculinity is, fast money, fast cars, fast women. It can slide into that. I mean, that is apparently for many young men today, that's becoming the real man. I just got a email from a former graduate student of mine who's teaching now at the high school level. And she said, all my male students are fans of Andrew Tate.
Yeah.
They're even using quotes of his in the yearbook. And then she said, I'm teaching at a classical Christian school. So even our Christian young men are looking to places like Andrew Tate, who are exemplifying a very secular view of masculinity. I mean, I don't know. I'm finding out not everyone knows this, but he does run. He's made a lot of his money by running an OnlyFans company.
Yeah.
And
Andrew Tate is a pretty complicated fella, and he's, I have hopes that he will reform his ways. I've seen glimmers of hope there. That he can embrace more the PPP that you mentioned before than the FFF, fast cars, fast women, and fast success. But instead, protect, provide, and what was the third one?
Procreate.
Procreate, yeah. Within marriage, I would say. But yeah, there's no question about it. Tate has struck a nerve, and he's preaching a gospel of masculine excellence. And at the same time, there's a lot of that real man script mixed in with his message. And really what we need is, insight from the designer of masculinity himself, and we can find that in scripture, and we can find that also in our own souls, seeing these different sides of us, the image of God, the Imago Dei stamped upon us, but then also our fallenness. So really, really deep points. And I encourage you, listeners, that if you're curious about this at all, check out this book, get yourself a copy, The Toxic War Against Masculinity. Well, this has been a great conversation. How can people find out more about you, Nancy?
Yes, I'm glad you asked, because my publisher graciously just designed a new website for me. So it's nancypearcey.com, and Pearcey is Pearcey, nancypearcey.com. And so you can come over there. You can browse my other books. You've mentioned a few of them already today. You can browse them and find out what he was talking about. And you can also leave a message. I don't have time to answer them all, but I do read them all. So come on by, nancypearcey.com. Come on by and say hello.
Very good. Well, thanks so much for joining me on Restitutio today.
Thanks for having me.